I think sometimes people who are considering homeschooling, they have all of their reasons not to do it or the fears about it, but also to consider and bear in mind the possible fruit or what could come of that or what you do want. There's a lot of fears of what if this doesn't turn out or what if, they don't have social skills, but instead to think, what is it that I do want for my family? What is sort of my vision for our flourishing together? And what's the best way to reach that? And if it seems like homeschooling is the best way to realize that, then don't be afraid to take that step or to jump in or to ask more questions because it could be a really beautiful opportunity.
Welcome to Homeschool Talks, a podcast by HSLDA. This is a show about all things homeschooling, from practical tips to inspiring stories and everything in between. You can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes as well as upcoming guests and topics, sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. We're so glad you've joined us today, and we hope you enjoyed the program. Here's your host.
Welcome to Homeschool Talks. My name is Jeremiah Lorrig. I'm the director of Generation Joshua, a part of Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and we are here today joined by Grace Snell. Grace is a journalist at World Magazine and a homeschool graduate. Thank you for joining us today, Grace. Can you tell our audience a little bit about yourself and your work that you do at World Magazine?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. So, I work at World as a features reporter. I do long form magazine features and then some shorter features for the podcast, mostly human interest, but covering the whole spectrum of you'll have a news peg and then kind of dive deeper to look at how is this affecting real people in real places across the world. So I've been doing this for about a year and a half now. I went to Barry College, graduated in December 2022, studied journalism there and had an art and a German minor. Yeah.
Great. So you started, though, before college, you were homeschooled. Could you tell us a little bit about what that looked like in your family?
So that was a huge part of my life growing up. I like to say that I came from kind of a nomadic tribe. We were 6 siblings, all homeschooled. My dad was an Army Ranger, so we moved around about every 3 to 5 years. And so our whole lives were kind of broken up into these seasons. We could say, okay, this happened at that house, this happened at that house. And as part of that, we were homeschooled because we could pack up, take our books with us, and go explore the world and not have to restart new every time in a brand new school system. And also, we just loved being able to spend time together as a family and then sort of explore with each other, spend time together and learn more about the world together.
Yeah, the military life can be disruptive when you're moving from one place to another, but it sounds like homeschooling was an area where you could create some continuity that didn't need to be as disrupted.
Absolutely. Kind of home is wherever my family is, and wherever we would go, we would sit around this long harvest table, paint the walls the same color of yellow, get out our read aloud books, and just fellowship. And that was home. That was stability. So I think people often ask, was that so difficult moving from place to place? And having that core with my family, with my siblings, with the love of learning, it really made it a beautiful thing versus a disruptive or a troublesome thing. It was always exciting. I think my mom especially did a really good job framing this as, hey, this is an adventure that we get to do together. It's not a bother. It's a new chapter.
That's great. So when you were little, what were some of your favorite subjects in school or things to study?
I always loved reading and writing. My dad nicknamed me Greedy for Stories because I would just say, can we read another chapter? Can we watch another movie? Can we, see another episode? Can we read another book together? And I loved hearing our family stories. And so that kind of later fed into my love of journalism because I wanted to say, there's stories happening all around us, real people, real events, and wanting to dive in and explore that more. So I think part of that too, I also really loved history and looking back through the years and seeing what were the stories that played out there and how did that influence where we are today.
So as a journalist, you can still say you're hungry for stories.
Absolutely. Yes, that's my favorite part about my job.
That's amazing. So as you're growing up, you're moving all around, and you spent some time in Europe. Is that correct?
Yes, so we moved to Germany, in 2011 and stayed until 2016. So that was one of the most formative time periods of my life and one of the longest places actually that we lived as a family. So it was a big part of my life.
My mother, she was also a grew up in the military, and she lived in Aviano, Italy, and she was able to explore some of those historic places around Italy as a little girl. And so when we went as adults, as when I was an adult, she was able to look back and reflect on how things were changed and just kind of what her life was like back then. What were some of the things that you got to see and experience in Europe?
So my dad was stationed in Grafenwehr, Germany, which is close to the Czech border, about 3 hours north of Munich and about an hour south of Nuremberg. So just being in the Bavarian countryside with all these beautiful wheat fields. And here things are new for the most part. And there it was like, even their new things were hundreds of years old. You'd walk into your little town and there's a cathedral from the 1700s. And it's not a World Heritage Site, it's just there because it's such an old culture and they have so much history there. But then because we could homeschool, we traveled widely. And so it was really neat. Like we could learn about World War II and then go camping on the beaches of Normandy. Or we could learn about the Renaissance and then fly down to Rome and travel and see the Vatican or the Borghese Gallery and learn about these different movements. And then it made it so much more real to go and really walk the streets and see where that happened and even see the graves of the people who played out those roles in history.
You mentioned your art focus in college. Do you think that's tied to your experiences where you could take those epic field trips as a child in Europe?
Absolutely. So, my art teacher in middle school actually went with us on this trip to Rome. And it was so amazing and eye opening for me to get to go to these beautiful places and see the creativity of people that God had made and see how that glorifies Him. And it made me want to do that more with the written word or with, you know, painting and visual images as well.
Yeah, it's amazing how an image can also tell a story as the painter is communicating. It is frozen in time, but there's the whole context of how it came, the story that's being portrayed came to be. So even art can be feeding your passion for stories, your hunger for stories.
Absolutely. And feeding your imagination to be able to see those stories in the world around you. I think as a journalist, we don't have the luxury of making stuff up. So you really have to have a trained eye to notice when something interesting is happening or when you meet an interesting person and to be able to pick out the really concrete visual details that will help bring that to life in a way that you're showing and not telling. So you're revealing something about a person's character through their actions and their setting and their surroundings versus just, stating it because we don't have that luxury, right? We have to keep it as factual as we can.
And you paint the story or the painting of your family as a nomadic tribe. That's describing something, or it's not telling. Putting an image in my mind. What are some of the other images of your homeschool experience that come to your mind?
Well, in the earliest days, my dad was stationed in Kansas. And so I kind of think of that as our little house on the prairie phase. We were just running around barefoot in the backyard, reading books, growing sunflowers, composting. And so there's just a lot of joy to that season. And then, from there, we moved to Germany. And that was kind of our epic exploration phase. We went to almost 30 countries, camping, flying, driving. All kinds of different things that we did. And then coming back, we stayed in St. Louis. My dad was a professor of military science there. And so there was a lot of like intellectualism and just diving into that sphere of learning at the university level. I started doing dual enrollment classes. So it's kind of neat to see the different phases of life like that.
And what I love about that is if you could spend all your time focusing on your epic adventure phase in Europe, but you also paint a really beautiful picture of what it was like to live in Kansas. And when you're in your little house phase there, what were some of those formidable lessons that you learned on the prairie, so to speak?
I think one of the biggest ones was just having good people around us, the importance of that. My dad did 2 tours in Iraq during that time, and we really relied on our church community, and we relied on our neighbors. Um, we lived on a street that my parents jokingly called the street of religious zealots because it was housing that was for a big family, but for a younger officer, so captain level pay, but with a big family. And so we were the crazy Protestants, our next door neighbors were the crazy Catholics, and we grew up with them, like, just doing life together, sitting around the dinner table, um, working in the garden, jumping on the trampoline, those kinds of things, and I think that that life on life kind of learning really makes the lessons stick in a much deeper way.
So when you go back to the Midwest and you're in the St. Louis area, what were some of the formative things that happened there?
I think the most formative thing, was just spending time in our church community there. We went to Chesterfield Presbyterian Church, and they had a really in-depth youth ministry, and just finding ways to get involved with what they were doing, whether that was through the youth group or we partnered with the church in the inner city, kind of a sister church, and just going to these neighborhoods, many of them that were kind of run down or impoverished or falling apart, but connecting with brothers and sisters there and really wrestling with some questions of, what does justice look like? What does the role of the church look like in racial tensions and some of these different things? Um, Seeing what it looked like for the church to be really deeply involved in community there.
So your homeschool experience had a a family community phase on the prairie. It had a world community phase in Europe, and then a church community phase in St. Louis. It seems like your community has been a major theme and something that really came out of your homeschool experience.
Yes, absolutely. It's kind of amazing now because I have friends, in so many different countries, so many different states. Most places that you could think of traveling, I either know someone there or a friend of a friend, or there's someone there that I could crash on their couch or come for dinner. And it's really beautiful to see how in each chapter of this story there were kindred spirits, really close friends, really dear people through each phase of that. And to differing degrees, we've stayed in touch with them, but they're the kinds of people where it's like, you can say, see you down the road, or, we'll pick up right where we left off when I see you again or when I'm next in that part of the world.
That's fantastic. And as I think about the different forms of community, it really just demonstrates how, whether it's the family community, the world community, or the church community, your homeschool story really answered the question about what about socialization that a lot of people like to throw at homeschoolers.
Yes, definitely. That was never really a problem, partly because um, our house was a fun place to be, so we'd have people over all the time, and we'd just spend hours playing in the backyard, or, we were used to being the new people, but that meant we were also used to making connections quickly, and used to being the ones to reach out, even if we were new there, being the ones to take that step to make friends with someone when you're only gonna be there for maybe 3 years, maybe 5 years, or maybe you don't even know how long you're gonna be there. So it definitely put this sort of sense of urgency to building that community of, I don't have the time to wait around for someone else to take that step, but I can be a welcoming person and a hospitable person.
So put yourself in the seat of, we're talking to a new homeschooler who maybe they're homeschooling in high school for the first time, or a homeschool mom who has just started this time and they are worried about making connections and friends. Do you have any advice for how to make those friends and build that community around you?
Mm. I think inviting people into what you're already doing is a great thing. If there are things that you love, maybe think, who else might love doing this with me too? And finding a way to kind of invite them into that. Um, and also looking around because there's already a lot of great resources out there, whether it's through church community or small groups or homeschool groups to get connected with, and to not be afraid to just show up, not be afraid to be the new kid, to kind of put yourself out there. Um, because I think most people, they are as nervous as you are, even if it seems like they're super established, or maybe they seem like the super cool homeschool mom who's been doing this forever. Um, but that there's something that you bring to the table there that they can learn from too, and vice versa. So to not be afraid to take that risk, even if it is a little bit um, uncomfortable, and to know that you bring something valuable to the table too.
And as we bring these valuable things to the table, it's the kind of thing that builds community. And as I think about the reality of the homeschool movement, having moved from kind of that fringe movement of the 80s and 90s to something that's a very established element of our society. Like everybody knows a homeschooler now. I think part of how we got there was through building that community and inviting people into things that we were already doing.
Yeah, I think in the early days of homeschooling, it was kind of defined by being the thing that wasn't part of the established institution. And so people really had to rely on their friends and neighbors. And so even now that homeschooling is a more accepted social institution, I would kind of encourage homeschool families not to be institutionalized, in the sense that they don't forget um, the people behind this and forget to still be neighborly, and to still reach out and make those connections, and to really value that part of homeschooling.
So, kind of taking that next step, as you went through your homeschooling and everything, you started to have this passion for stories, this hunger for stories, and now you're a journalist. How did homeschooling set you up for that career path?
It set me up so well in giving me a big framework to ask questions, and to not be afraid of the answers, and to not be afraid of encountering the world, of encountering different perspectives. I'm really grateful for the way that my parents kind of built a solid Christian worldview foundation, but that they really reinforced this idea that, hey, all truth is God's truth. So if there's something out there that's good, true, and beautiful, it can point us back to Him. And we don't need to be afraid of encountering something that's going to, subvert what is true. And so, because of that, you can go to a foreign country. You can read a book on the banned book list. You can talk to someone who has a different background or a different perspective, and be curious about that instead of being defensive.
And what would you say is one of the things that you're most thankful for your parents in this process, where they were making that decision to homeschool you and they set you up for what you are now?
Honestly, I don't really have the words for how grateful I am for their deep, thoughtful investment in who I am as a person, in my education, my love of learning. Everything about what they did with us was very intentional. There was a reason behind it, and they made it very clear the reason behind it. And so we knew that if there was something we were doing that was different than what everybody else was doing, we understood the why behind it, and we were on board with that. It wasn't just arbitrary rules, or, oh, we're not going to go to public school, or we're not going to do something this way, but it was, hey, this is the way that we're going to do, school, because we really value spending time together. Not because everybody else is wrong, but because we really love something here and there's something we want to be a part of. Um, and that was so deeply formative to who I am today, to really value learning in a community of faith, and also exploring the wider world.
And as a parent is considering high school for their students, one of the things that you mentioned was that big framework that allows you to have a strong foundation, but a wide lens where you can engage people well. What are some things that you would recommend for high schoolers to do to help establish that wider framework and that strong foundation, that vital combination?
I think reading widely and really wrestling with ideas, even if there are books that come from a very different perspective, not being afraid to crack them open and to talk about them, and to talk about them with other people. We also did dual enrollment classes, which I really loved, because it was a chance to kind of step out into a different school setting and then come home and process, okay, what did I experience there? Who did I meet? and to start to rub shoulders with people who are different than me, and for that to not be a scary thing, but to learn how to bridge and be in both worlds well.
And do you have any advice for a parent who's considering high school homeschooling and what they can do to establish some of these principles well?
I think just knowing that it's doable is a big one. I think people often think of homeschooling little kids, but then they feel really inadequate of how could I ever teach math? I was terrible at math or something like that. But just to know that there's a lot of great resources out there, whether that's through a co-op or just through a really good math curriculum, but that it is doable and that your student will kind of start to learn once they find those things that they love, it'll kind of become a self-directed learning, versus something that you just have to drag them through, and that's a really exciting thing to see.
Well, once again, you're coming back to your theme of community. There's resources, there's people, there's hope, and there's also good stories of people, parents who've walked this path before, and they can speak into your life well.
Yes, absolutely. I can't touch on that enough.
Fantastic. Well, as we're coming to an end here, is there anything that you would like to tell of your story that would maybe give a little bit more perspective for somebody who's thinking about maybe going into storytelling as a journalist or something along those lines?
Yeah, I guess I can talk a little bit about how I got into this line of work. I went to Barry College, as I mentioned at the beginning. And then from there, World has a 2-week college journalism intensive. It's called the World Journalism Institute. And I kind of stumbled into that through homeschooling, actually, because getting World Magazine was a part of our curriculum. It was sort of our current events component of our learning. And there was an ad in there for their World Journalism Institute, and my mom said, "Hey, maybe try this." And it was the COVID pandemic year, the year the world shut down, and I didn't have anything else lined up, so I applied the day before the deadline and got into this course, and had a really cool opportunity to just learn from seasoned reporters, writers, editors, to have my work edited very strictly. They really took out the red pen and to learn to not take that personally, but to see that as a chance to grow. Um, and I think that if other people are interested, that's a great opportunity if you are looking to get your foot in the door, um, with journalism, but also you want to learn the worldview component as well. And how do you um, bring your worldview to bear in your reporting and strive for objectivity, um, while also acknowledging the complexity of all the different perspectives that we encounter. I think that that's a great way to do that. It was a really good on ramp for me. I did 2 internships with them after that, and then came on staff January 2023.
And as somebody who's hungry for stories, what is one way that somebody could foster their awareness of stories that are happening around them? I think the world is it's really tempting sometimes for us to go for a walk, but instead of looking around and seeing the stories, we're pulling out our phone and spending time on the screen. What would you recommend somebody do to be more aware of the stories that are happening around them?
Mhm. I think slowing down is a huge piece of that. And full disclosure, it's not something that I do really well, but I think it is really difficult to see the world around you if you're rushing by at a million miles an hour. So really taking the time to look and to see. Then there's also something Ira Glass says actually, which is pay attention to your attention. If there's something that really grabs your attention or really tugs at your heart, sort of a theme of what you're interested in, follow that and pursue that and kind of keep tabs on that, because that's what has the most potential to grow into a story. Because if you care about it, then chances are somebody else will care about it. And if you're excited about it, they'll be excited to read about it.
That's really interesting. I just had a flashback to I was out for a run probably a month or two ago, and there was this kid on a bike who stopped like right in front of me, and he took a picture of a mailbox. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then, I go around the block and to another area and everything. And I come across him again, and he has found another mailbox. This one has flowers growing up it, and there's all these roses sticking out. And he's taken a picture again. And I was like, oh, wow, he's like really into these mailboxes. And then I go a little further, and there he is again at another mailbox. This one's built into a hedge. And he has just decided that he was going to find the coolest mailboxes in all the neighborhood. And he was just sitting there taking pictures of them. And I was like, wow, this kid knows what he wants. He knows what interests him. And he just spent that evening, I guess, taking pictures of mailboxes.
I love that, because there's something fascinating in that for him, and something that, someone running by like yourself or like me wouldn't notice unless somebody else called it to our attention. So sometimes it takes, somebody else saying, hey, look at this. Isn't this beautiful? Isn't this cool? So I really love that.
Yeah, me too. I mean, now every time I pass those mailboxes, I'm like, somebody noticed that was a cool mailbox. So I guess as a homeschool alum now, do you have any thoughts for encouraging somebody who's maybe considering homeschooling, what they should hold in mind as they're making this decision in this process?
I think sometimes people who are considering homeschooling, they have all of their reasons not to do it or the fears about it, but also to consider and bear in mind the possible fruit or what could come of that or what you do want. There's a lot of fears of what if this doesn't turn out, or what if, they don't have social skills, but instead to think, what is it that I do want for my family? What is sort of my vision for our flourishing together? And what's the best way to reach that? And if it seems like homeschooling is the best way to realize that, then don't be afraid to take that step or to jump in or to ask more questions, because it could be a really beautiful opportunity.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us again. And I appreciate the perspective, the thoughts, the beautiful hunger for stories, and the way you continually bring us back to community. As our listeners are thinking about this, is there a place that they can go to hear your podcasts and some of your stories that you're telling?
Yeah, absolutely. So our website is wng.org. So you can look up my name there, or you can just look at our other great coverage. We've got a lot of awesome reporters working on that. Or we have a free daily news podcast called The World and Everything in It. And I'll be on there from time to time, but there's a lot of great coverage and interesting voices on there as well.
Great. So go to the World News. What's the website again?
wng.org, World News Group. And then the podcast is The World and Everything in It.
And search for Grace Snell. Awesome. Well, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
And for everybody who's listening, thank you all. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends. If you would like to get upcoming podcast episodes delivered straight to your inbox, sign up for our Homeschool Talks email list, and subscribers will receive exclusive content. And if you're not yet a member of HSLDA, we would love to have you join us. Please go to homeschooltalks.com/join. Thanks again.
Today's episode is made possible by HSLDA's Compassion Grants program. Whether it's a low-income family trying to make ends meet or a family suffering after a natural disaster, some families simply wouldn't have the resources to homeschool without the help of fellow homeschoolers like you. Our Compassion Grants exist to make this support possible. To learn more about how you can help make homeschooling possible for struggling families, or to request assistance if you are homeschooling through hard times, visit hslda.org/compassion. That's hslda.org/compassion. Thanks for listening to this episode of Homeschool Talks. If you've enjoyed this conversation, will you do us a favor by sharing it with a friend or leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts? As a reminder, you can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes, as well as upcoming guests and topics, you can sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. That's all for now. We hope you enjoyed this program, and we'll see you next time.